I'm David Greenwald, and today I'm going to talk about using the court watch to expose everyday injustice. And everyday injustice is really what we call the average problem that afflicts the system. There are problems that we see that are massive problems, like 40 years incarcerated for a crime that you didn't commit, or death penalty, trying to execute somebody who might be innocent or might have been mentally incompetent or not received adequate defense. But what we're really talking about is finding everyday injustice, the little injustices that are actually a much bigger deal than a lot of people are willing to admit. There's a big problem in trying to hold people accountable in the criminal legal system. And the big problem is that local media is, in fact, dying. And so, if newspapers do not have the resources to put reporters into the court and adequately report on what's happening, how do we hold prosecutors and courts accountable? One of my board members and a reporter of ours, Kress, he worked in the Sacramento Bee in the 70s, and he worked in the Capitol office. And basically, in the Capitol, they had more people in the Capitol in the late 70s than the Sacramento Bee has in its entire unit now, their entire newsroom. That's incredible. So, how do we hold prosecutors and courts accountable if we do not have access to what's happening? So, this is the basic problem. The media lacks the resources to cover the courts. The courts are the least transparent branch of government. And that's something that I think a lot of people understand, but maybe don't really understand. The fact is, you can watch Congress on C-SPAN. You can watch state legislators on various things. You can even watch your local city council if you have access to cable or if they stream it on the internet. But you can't really do that in a non-COVID world, at least, with the courts. And so the result is that outside of a few high-profile cases, the typical court case does not get enough coverage. Newspapers are cutting back on their operations. This allows the police and prosecution to get away with misconduct. And as a result, the public is unaware of the true nature of the system. So here's what we came up with. I met with a friend of mine who was in law school in 2010, and we sat down and we asked, okay, what can we do to adequately cover what's happening in the courts? And we came up with the idea of the Court Watch. So we recruit interns from the local university. We train them on how to monitor cases. A few years later, after having them do that, we taught them how to write journalistic articles, journalism basically. We send them to the courthouse, at least in the non-COVID era, and they monitor cases, trials, and hearings. And then we post these articles on our website, davisvanguard.org. And what we've discovered is that through this court watch system, we can actually stop wrongful convictions before they happen. The amazing thing is that most people, as I said, don't know what's happening in the court system. And so if we go back here, when I say monitoring cases, trials, and hearings, so about 3% of all criminal matters actually end up going to trial, which means that the majority of them are getting settled out at the preliminary hearing stage, either just after or just before. And so if you're not covering preliminary hearings, you're really not covering what's happening in the court system itself. So what we are doing now is almost revolutionary. We are covering at least 10 different courtrooms throughout the state of California. We have students from at least 15 different colleges. Right now, our intern number is a little lower than this. This was over the summer. We're probably at 50 to 60, but we're still publishing about 5 articles a day of court and criminal justice reform coverage. So let's talk about what we've been able to do. We covered a case that ended up being 25 years to life for stealing a package of shredded cheese. So the story here is that this guy is probably quasi-homeless. He's definitely suffering from some sort of mental illness. And he's got this really long rap sheet, like several pages long. But it's all petty offenses, right? It's petty theft. It's all these minor charges, drinking in public, maybe some DUIs, I don't know. But nothing really, really bad. But he's spending time in prison and in the jail, and he's definitely been in the system for a long time. So this case happens in 2009. He goes into the local grocery store. He's got some money, by the way. He purchases some of the products, but then he puts a package of shredded cheese into his pants pocket, pays for this other stuff, and leaves. Of course, loss prevention sees him stealing this. They grab him or detain him outside, and then the local district attorney decides. And remember, this is 2009. So there's changes to state law that enabled this to happen back then that can't happen now. Nevertheless, he's charged with petty theft with a prior, which you could charge as a felony in 2009. You can't do that anymore. And also in the pre-Prop 36 stages, you could charge a nonviolent third strike offense. So this guy who did nothing other than steal this bag of shredded cheese is facing a third strike for this offense, 25 years to life. So we report on it. And then as the result of our reporting on it, it ends up getting picked up by the Sacramento Bee, who saw our article. And because the Bee reported on it, the New York Times picked it up. And because the New York Times picked it up, the Guardian of London picked it up. And so all of a sudden, there's all this heat and pressure on the district attorney. So the district attorney in this case decides that, okay, this is maybe a little bit of overkill, you think? And he ends up striking the last strike. Now, lest you think this is justice served, it really isn't, because a 2-strike offense for this ends up being 7 years and 8 months in prison. So instead of 25 to life for stealing a bag of shredded cheese, he gets nearly 8 years in prison. This is probably the worst police abuse case I've ever seen. Even taking into account, we have a lot of these that end up being a fatal shooting or killing. 2 brothers, Mexican nationals, are down by the river near Sacramento around 1 a.m. They end up being approached by the police. Who knows whether they were drinking or doing drugs or what, but they end up starting to walk away. And of course, remember, these guys are probably not here legally. They're definitely not citizens. And they also don't speak English real well. But by the time the police get involved here, one thing leads to another, and it becomes an altercation. And the brothers end up getting beaten. I mean, and I'll be blunt, the police beat the hell out of these guys. You can see on this blown up photo, this is Ernesto Galvan. This is a dent. Those were caused by batons. They were hit repeatedly in the head with batons. They were hit with tasers. And over what? There's really no core offense here. It's not even clear that they were initially even breaking the law. They were simply out in the dark late at night, and then they resisted something, even though it's not clear whether or not they could legally detain them at the point where they were resisting. So they end up getting charged with battery on a police officer and obviously resisting arrest. Um, this case goes to trial 3 times. So the first time was before we were around, 2007. They end up hanging 11 to 1 for guilt. But we ended up stumbling on this case in 2010. It was one of actually the first cases that we covered. And the trial happened, and they hang 11 to 1 for guilt. The one guy is a lecturer or employee at UC Davis, and I ended up getting in contact with him and talking to him, and he basically told me he was under all this pressure to cave in, but he was willing to hold out there basically until until everybody else gave up. He was not going to find them guilty in this offense. So eventually it hangs 11 to 1. It goes to another hearing, another trial in November of 2010. And this time it's taken up by one of the deputy public defenders, an excellent attorney named Martha Sequeira. And she really put the screws to these police officers. By now, they have a record, right? Because you have two prior trials, um, and there are major discrepancies in their accounts, and their accounts don't make sense anyway. And so she was able to really expose that, and ultimately they get acquitted on one of the accounts, and then the jury hangs 7 to 5 for acquittal this time in the other. Now, when we first started covering this, we were literally the only media there. I don't understand how that happened. Actually, I think the 2007 case got some coverage, but the media kind of lost this case. But by the time we were done with this case in 2010, the end of 2010, the community's up in arms about this. This is an outrageous case. This is not a subtle case. There are protests, there's coverage in the B, there's coverage in some of the San Francisco papers, the Mexican consulate's getting involved. And the DA finally, acknowledged that they were not going to get a conviction under these circumstances, and they finally, dropped the charges. The brothers sued. They got 5 or 600,000. It sounds better than it is, but at least it was something. But this was a tragic case. Ernesto actually died early last year. He suffered severe brain injury. He was completely psychotic by the end. He thought he was hearing voices from the Pope and various other things. So just a tragic case, and a case that really wouldn't have gotten the coverage but for us. So one of the interesting things is that, I started this really locally. I started this in Yolo County, a small county in California, right across the river from the capital. But I was flying across the country on vacation, and I read the book Just Mercy, which is a great book, and people should definitely read it. I know it came out as a movie, which was really good last year. But I always suggest read the book. Um, but as I was reading this book, and he's going through all these cases that are wrongful conviction cases, I'm realizing that the problems that we see here in California are the same as problems in other parts of the country, maybe even worse. And one of the big problems is that a lot of places don't have adequate public defender systems. Out here in California, a lot of the counties I cover, they have excellent public defenders, and so you see people that are poor and exposed, and yeah, they're still getting caught up in the system, but at least they got reasonable representation. Whereas some of the cases that Stevenson's covering after the fact, really that isn't the case. And so, as I'm watching this, or reading this rather, what I learned was that wrongful convictions and injustice happen because we have no oversight or transparency. People do not know what's going on in the system. And so I came to the realization that we have to put eyes in every courtroom in the country. And so as soon as I got back to California, the first thing I did was make an appointment, and I met with San Francisco Public Defender Jeff Adachi. I had seen Jeff Adachi give a Justice Summit back starting in 2011, and suddenly realized that criminal justice reform and some of the things that we were seeing in Yolo County were problems everywhere. And I realized what we could start doing if we started to engage the community. So I came back to Jeff in 2015 and said, "Hey, we want to start a court watch in San Francisco." And he was agreeable, but we couldn't figure out how to do it with our resources at that time. Unfortunately, Jeff died almost 2 years ago to the day, February 22nd, 2019. And, when I met with his successor, Mano Raju, I was talking to him about what we were doing, and he said, "Well, you should come out here." And I said, "Well, I talked with Jeff about that. We just don't have the resources." But we put our heads together and we came up with a way to partner with the San Francisco Public Defender's Office in order to cover what's happening in the courts in San Francisco. And I was thinking, they have a fairly progressive DA in George Gascon, and I think, there shouldn't be a lot of problems, right? No, I was wrong. The first trial we covered in May 2019 was a molestation trial. And it was a horrible case because it was this 5-year-old little girl, and probably not her, but some relatives of her were planted probably in her mind that the boyfriend of her mother, who she was living with, had touched her in her genitalia. And, one of the things that became pretty obvious from the start was that, one of the issues in this case was that it didn't appear that the defendant, Mr. Carter Bibbs, actually had access to the little girl at any point by himself. The mother was always there. He was working most of the time, and the only time he was around the little girl, there was somebody else there. So unless they were acquiescing to this, which I guess is possible but improbable, it seemed unlikely. And the case really started falling apart when she tried to testify, and she really couldn't, give any details. And I understand it's a 5-year-old, but it became pretty clear. So there's a point in this case where the prosecution probably realized that this was going down in flames, and the prosecutor had the little girl and the DA investigator, and they were in the hallway with victims advocates. And apparently, a public defender investigator caught them in the hallway, started recording the conversation, and he caught the DA basically saying, "Yes, say that, testify to that," like she's coaching her on what to say on the stand. And this gets recorded, and the public defender investigator is testifying in the court about what happened. And ironically, the investigator himself gets prosecuted for illegal recording. There's nothing that happens about the alleged prosecutorial misconduct. And in this case, fortunately, this guy got world-class representation from the San Francisco Public Defender's Office, and the defendant was acquitted. So one of the great things that we're doing is we're able to really expand what we are doing across the country. or across the state. And so we're putting our resources into expanding our San Francisco project, into expanding what we are doing in other counties like Alameda County and LA County and maybe San Diego County, where we're putting resources into there. But we can't do this really without your help. We believe that we know how to bring justice and transparency to the court system, and we've done it for 15 years, and we've done it on the cheap. But we really get to the point where we need your help. And so we have a sustaining donor program, davisvanguard.networkforgood.com, and you can become a sustaining donor. And you don't have to have a lot of money. Like we get people signing up for $5, $10 a month. But we think that, some of the attorneys out there can probably help, $50 or $100 a month. That's not a ton of money for somebody making a reasonable amount. $25 a month for a community leader, $5 to $10 for students or people that don't make a lot of money. Hey, whatever you can give makes a huge difference. And you can also make a one-time donation, or you could do it, one lump sum and have it charge your card once a year. So what are we going to do with those donations? Well, we want to hire some investigative reporters. We have interns in the courtroom, but we need to follow up on some of these cases, and that's going to cost money. We need to pay for our oversight and our training programs. We have a lot of administrative costs. This is an expanding program. We probably have over 100 writers working on it right now. So in order to continue to expand, we need more resources. And we're always learning and expanding our horizons. But the bottom line is we really need your help to take it to the next level. So if you can go to davisvanguard.networkforgood.com, become a sustaining donor, that would be a big help, and it would help a tremendous program to continue going. So I want to thank everybody for coming on here. You can check out our website at davisvanguard.org. We are in the process of building a new website. Thank you, and this has been a great time.